Hello everyone and welcome back to the next video in the Ensemble Stars vocal analysis series. We're going to be talking about Yuta today, and in the last video I had said that I wanted to talk a little bit more about what exactly I mean when I'm referring to vocal tone, because that's a word that's going to come up a lot in these videos, and I had mentioned that I wanted to wait until this video because essentially that's what we're going to be spending most of it talking about. So what is tone when it comes to singing? Well, tone essentially is the way that our ear perceives certain voices and allows us to differentiate between those voices. It's generally used as kind of a catch-all for a bunch of different aspects of singing, but there are some people that will use different terms depending on what exactly they're talking about. You might hear things like vocal quality or vocal color. All of those are mostly related to tone, at least in the sense that if you were just to call that tone, it wouldn't be incorrect. The one word that I've seen used in some places that seems to be a little more controversial in terms of it referring to specifically voices is either timbre or timbre, depending on where you're from and how you pronounce it. And timbre specifically refers to the ability of the ear to differentiate between instruments. So let's say you had the same pitch being played on a piano, a guitar, and a trumpet. The timbre of the individual instrument would allow you to say what instrument it is. And when it comes to singing, some people argue that timbre isn't really a good word to use because in essence, all of the instruments are the voice. So it's the same instrument we're talking about. But either way, these are all different terms you might hear being used. Tone kind of encompasses all of that, and it's usually just easier for me to use that instead of trying to pick out one word or the other in a specific situation. Although sometimes I will admit, even listening back to some of the other videos, if I'm talking about two different aspects of tone within the same sentence or the same situation, I will try to find a way to differentiate what I'm talking about, just to make it a little easier to understand, especially as a music teacher. If I feel like I'm listening to myself and I don't know what I'm saying, then there's no way I'm conveying that appropriately. So that's something I'm going to try and work on, just to hopefully avoid some confusion in the future and make my points a little clearer. So that's my explanation of tone, and I hope, if you were wondering, that kind of clarifies why I use that word in place of a myriad of others that you might see occasionally being used to refer to the same sort of thing. Now, on that note, we are going to move into Twink as a group, and in this video, at least specifically Yuta. And I think I had said before that I've gotten a few requests for Yuta out of the twins, and the main reason I would assume people are more interested in hearing a vocal analysis of him is because his voice has changed more throughout the series. And you'll hear that as we go along, but in a lot of the earlier songs, it's hard to differentiate between the twins' voices, and it seems kind of like the voice that was being used for the twins at the beginning eventually kind of morphed into Hinata's voice specifically, and then Yuta's voice went in a different direction. So we'll talk about that, and we'll be able to hear that as we go through this. But the whole point of that spiel at the beginning is that the difference between the twins' voices can mostly be attributed to tone. There are other things involved, such as certain singing techniques, but a lot of times that kind of goes hand in hand with creating a specific tone, almost kind of forcing you to use certain techniques to keep it sounding a certain way. So if I had to describe the difference between them, I would say that Hinata's tone, typically, it's very bright, it's very sharp. The attack on the note, and when I refer to an attack on notes, what that means is the initial way that the note sounds. So you can actually do different vocal techniques to get notes to start differently. Hinata kind of tends to hit them head on, so the opening sound is very sharp. There's an almost glottal aspect to it in the sense that the note starts very quickly and typically ends very quickly. And if you ever hear of something called a glottal stop, it's basically just kind of voluntarily closing your throat up to cut the sound off really quickly. And that's the impression I get from a lot of Hinata's singing. In contrast, Yuta's voice uses a bit of a deeper tone. It's more mellow. He tends to draw out words instead of ending them as sharply as Hinata does. And the other thing that Yuta does in terms of the attack, if you listen to how he starts his notes, it's almost like he comes from underneath them instead of hitting them directly head on. So in essence, even though I said at the beginning, it's a difference in tone. It is. There's more that goes into it. And the hardest thing about voicing two characters that are singing at the same time as each other is probably just keeping the mindset as to what character you're voicing at any particular time to make sure that it stays consistent. And as time has gone on, I think Soma's really developed a voice for each of them that is unique, and that is to the point that if I hear a song, especially a recent Twink song, I know who's singing as soon as I hear their voices, and that comes down to consistency in terms of voicing the characters. So that again was probably a longer introduction than I wanted it to be, but I hope all of that makes sense. The first thing I wanted to do when looking at Yuta is, because Soma has voiced characters in so many series that he has sung for those characters in, I've put together, it's like a 20-second clip of 4 different characters that he has voiced that I'm familiar with. So you can hear the range that he's working with, and I think this goes into it fairly well, so I'll let you listen to it. I'll say who the characters are at the end. I might pop pictures up on the screen if I remember, but here we go. So in order, those are Ten from Idolish 7, Gentaro from Hypnosis Mic, and then Namazuo and Tsurumaru, who are both from Touken Ranbu, which is another series that he voices 2 characters in that have, I'd say, even more distinct voices than the twins do in On Stars. And I realize that maybe I should have done this for some of the other videos too, just to kind of show the range of the voice actors, but I really thought of it for this video again because it relates to what we're talking about, and I'll try to do it more in the future. Regardless, I think those examples show a lot of different types of voices that Soma uses for the characters that he is singing for. So I've talked enough about other series and other things in this video already. Let's get right into the On Stars music. So I will admit, even at this point, I haven't listened to Twink's earlier music that much, mostly because kind of that form of electropop isn't really my preferred genre of music. Even though there's nothing wrong with the songs, they're perfectly fine for that genre, it's just not really what I would choose to listen to in my own time. But listening to it for this series is very interesting because in that one, you can hear that there's a tiny bit of what eventually becomes Yuta's voice, particularly at the ends of phrases when it goes a little breathy instead of, like I said, hitting the notes head on. But there's a lot of aspects that have it sounding very similar to what I would say eventually becomes Hinata's main voice. And when they're singing together, there's not much to tell between them. It just kind of sounds like the same track layered over itself. And I will say I did have a suggestion from a commenter on the last video that if I'm talking for a long time and I go back to reference something that was played in the clips, that it would be helpful to have it played again. Hopefully, if I remember when I'm editing, I'll try and do that, because what I wanted to specifically talk about was the last part where there's a jump in the pitch and the note goes quite a bit higher. And you can hear he actually kind of shifts from the little breathier Yuta voice that he's using to a very clean attack on the upper part of the note, which is something that he completely gets rid of in future songs, and I think that's really just part of the progression. So this one, there's not actually a whole lot to pull out of. A lot of times it feels like with Twink songs, either they're singing in ways that are almost overlapping each other, so it's very hard to isolate vocals, or they have a really long solos. So that one is the former. And that one, again, there's just not a whole lot to pick out from in terms of differentiating between their voices. You can still hear kind of that little breathy aspect that he's adding to Yuta's voice to make it at least a little bit different than Hinata's, but the biggest thing I would say at this point is that their bass tone is very similar. He's using slightly different techniques, but the basic tone level that he's singing at is almost the same, and that's something, again, that changes quite a bit. So getting into the second album, I would say this is kind of where he starts to solidify what Yuta's voice exactly sounds like. You can hear that his tone is already staying much lower than it was in the other ones, and it's staying there consistently. He's not kind of popping back up into that really bright sounding tone. Even when he's going into higher notes, he's still keeping that, like I said, it's almost under singing the beginning of the notes and keeping that breathier quality to it that becomes the standard for Yuta's voice as it goes on. And at least in this video, I know in the previous ones, I'd always put the name up on the top left-hand corner of the screen if there was a duet happening. I haven't done that here because there's only 2 members of the unit, so if there's a duet happening, it's obviously with Hinata. But I've tried to put in at least one line of them singing together every 2 or 3 songs, again, just to illustrate that progression. And even in this one, you can hear that there is a distinct difference between their voices. Even though they're singing the same notes, tonally there's enough of a variance that it's easy to tell that it's supposed to be 2 different people singing and not just a layering effect on the same voice. So I think Heart Prism Symmetry illustrates my point a little better than Twinkle Starbeat, mostly because Twinkle Starbeat, the notes are just higher, and it's harder to stay in that really low part of your tone if you're physically trying to sing higher notes. Eventually, Soma does start doing it more consistently, but it's one of those things that just feels more natural. If you're going higher, your tone kind of naturally lifts up because that's the part of your breath structure that you're working more with. And in this one, at least according to the wiki, even when there's parts that sounds like there's 2 people singing, apparently it is supposed to be vocal layering, so I'm going to trust them on that and say that it's just supposed to be the same voice layered over itself, which would explain why it sounds more similar. But I think in general, this is one of those songs, again, where it's kind of in the transitional period between really solidifying Yuta's voice and being able to sing the notes in a way that sounds good when the notes are just higher in general. I like where there's at least parts of songs where they talk so that I can put that in so you can get a baseline of their speaking voice. This one, kind of the opposite of the last one, because the melody itself is just lower, it's much easier for him to maintain that lower tone for Yuta's voice throughout. And there's not a whole lot of long sections that have solo work in this particular song, but even in the ones that are there, I think you can already hear that the consistency is starting to improve quite a bit from where it was at the beginning. So Wonder Wonder Toyland is probably one of my favorite Twink songs, and I don't know why I say in all these videos what my favorite song from all these units are, but somehow it always ends up in there. This one I think is a really good showcase because it does have longer solos, so you get to hear more of the vocals by themselves. And even though there are sections, especially in the last chorus, where he is singing quite high, he's starting to maintain keeping that lower tone. And this is something that it really isn't easy to do. So even though it might sound very natural, like your voice just wants to go higher when you're singing higher. So once again, I'm going to use the word control because the impression that I get from Soma in general is that he's very methodical about the work he does when he's voice acting and when he's singing. And it's hard to say what other voice actors would do in this same position, if this is something that the producer specifically asked him to do, or if it's something he just decided to do on his own. But either way, it's really interesting to listen through it in succession because you can tell that he's actively working and changing what he's doing for Yuta's voice. And even from the beginning, there were some things where it's like, they decided that that was something that he should have, and those stay, but just everything else becomes so much stronger and more distinct until it finally becomes like a completely separate entity from Hinata's. So there's not a whole lot that's new in Twink Introduction that I want to talk about. The point I want to highlight a little more is that even when he's getting up into the higher notes, he's starting to hit them under again, which is what Yuta typically does. In a lot of the earlier songs, the attack kind of changed to what Hinata does. Again, probably just to be able to hit the note easier. Now he's actually coming at them from underneath and still hitting the note perfectly fine. It's one of those things that's probably a combination of just a few years of experience on top of really setting those character voices and setting the vocal techniques used for those character voices and not switching between them anymore. I really like Play Tag too. One of the things I haven't mentioned too much in this video yet is vibrato, and that's mostly because Soma just has a very natural vibrato that he tends to use. Occasionally with Yuta, he'll pull it back a little bit, mostly because when you're trying to sustain notes and use that kind of breathy tone that he's using for Yuta, it's hard to do that in conjunction with vibrato because you'll get like a weird warbling effect that might happen. So it's a very deliberate choice that he's making. In general, when singers have very natural vibrato, sometimes it's even hard to notice because it just sounds good with what they're singing. So I probably won't mention it that much unless there's actively something happening that's a shift from what the normal vibrato in Yuta's voice would sound like. Otherwise, one of the things I wanted to mention is that I think these slower, more melodic songs suit Yuta's voice more because of the way that he's using his tone, the fact that it does have this kind of more mellow sound to it, this deeper sound to it. It allows him to show it off more in those songs, and I think I realized this listening more to later songs, but I'll mention it now just because it's on my mind. But usually when there's like a bigger moment in these songs, it's almost always Hinata that's doing it. And as time goes on, I'm inclined to believe the reason for that is because it's just much easier to hit certain notes, especially higher notes, louder notes, when using the vocal techniques that are being used for Hinata's voice. Whereas with Yuta, it's kind of the opposite. It's much easier to sing the lower parts, the more melodic parts, using those vocal techniques. So together, they sound really good because they sound different. But trying to get Yuta to do a big solo where he's going up into really high notes, it's very hard to maintain that voice. So I think that sort of shift was just a natural progression in their singing techniques, but it is something that I've kind of noticed, especially isolating Yuta's parts and listening to the rest of it with everything together. And then we get the anime ending song where, once again, I don't think there's really anything new to highlight. all of Yuta's solos keep to that mostly lower sweet spot of his tone that he's using. The music at the end goes up a little more, but he doesn't shift his tone at all to kind of hit the note any differently. It's still coming from underneath. And that's, I think, kind of the biggest thing that changes even throughout the single exclamation point era of Ensemble Stars, is just establishing what Yuta's voice sounds like and maintaining it regardless of the notes that he's singing. And as I mentioned in the last one right now, that means that a lot of what Yuta's singing seems a little simpler because it's being kept further down with lower notes and not really any vocal tricks that are happening. But that is something that does progress as we get into the double exclamation mark era, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Alright, so it is in fact the next day because I can never seem to actually get all of the commentary for these recorded at once. So, new day, new era of Ensemble Stars. The first song that they had in the 2 exclamation point era doesn't do a whole lot new in terms of Yuta's voice. By the time 2018, 2019 rolled around, his voice was pretty well set. There are a few new things that pop up as we move through the era of music being a thing. The most notable of which you can hear in the last section of this. And that is that they are finally starting to allow Yuta to sing lower notes. So in a lot of the other songs, when they had solo parts, typically they were mostly singing around the same pitch. If there was anything that went higher, eventually Hinata was the only one to do it, which we've talked about previously, but it never really went lower. And in this last section, you can hear that they're finally starting to let Yuta, when he has some solo lines, go down, I think, a lot lower than Hinata ever tends to do. And it's a part of Soma's vocal range that is fairly strong, and he does have characters that kind of sit in there naturally, but it's taken a while for Yuta to kind of get down to that point. And again, we'll see more of it as we go on, but important to note that it does kind of start here. So you've heard me complain about this before. The first feature 5-star unit event songs generally don't actually feature the quote-unquote featured character that much. This is another example of that, especially because this was the first event where Yuta had his new hairstyle and it was supposed to be a big deal, and I think looking at the breakdown of the song, Hinata actually sings more than he does in terms of solo lines, and there's really nothing that he's doing within those solo lines that's different or showing off any aspect of his voice that we haven't heard before. So like I've said in previous videos, it's not like there's anything wrong with these songs, it just feels like if you're giving a certain character a 5-star, the sense is that they should be more important in terms of what they're doing in the song. And for the first round, that really doesn't seem to be the case. And at this point, I think it's safe to say it's almost a pattern. Like, there's a few examples I can think of off the top of my head where that wasn't the case, but it seems to be the prevailing pattern that's been set up. So Polyphonic World, I think, is a good example of a song where Yuta is still singing the higher notes, but keeping the more distinct parts of his voice the way they are. And there's a couple of examples in here. I'll hopefully remember to put them both in back to back, but these two in particular. Where you can actually hear that he is swooping up to the high notes instead of, as I mentioned before, hitting them directly from the front. So it's a little bit of a different vocal technique and results in quite a different sound, even though the eventual pitch is the same. So obviously this video isn't a comparison, I don't have both of their parts here, but that is something if you wanted to go back and listen to, especially when we have songs where they have one chorus, say, where Hinata takes the solos, and the next chorus where Yuta takes the solos, and they're singing the same notes. Compare the two of them and just listen to how the notes start and end, and the way his voice sounds in both of those instances. Because it's really interesting as a good example of how pitch is not necessarily the be-all and end-all. Two voices singing the same pitch will never sound the same. In this case, one voice singing the same pitch does not necessarily have to sound the same. 夜の右から手を伸ばした時つけるんだ明日のライトはみ出せこの胸の裏腹無謀な後悔の引き波に変わっても構わないそうだろう Go ahead 激しく揺さぶる Cradle of the Deep And in this case, Turbulent Storm was a Hinata 5-star event, and I think this song fits Yuta's voice a lot more. It's kind of got this really murky, dark feeling to the synth percussion in the background that suits his voice really well. There's a little bit of a reverb effect going on with his voice, which just means that it's not really an echo because it's not as pronounced as an echo, but there's kind of a little bit of a doubling of what he's doing, and I think it fits the song itself really well. There's one note when he goes up that he does kind of switch into what at this point I will call Hinata voice, which is, again, a lot sharper. In this case, I think it's just because of the vowel that's there. It's much easier to keep a deeper tone when you're singing open vowels, because when you're singing vowels like E, you kind of have to close your mouth a certain way, and it's very hard to maintain that tone. So I don't necessarily blame him for that. I don't really think there's anything you can do in that. But otherwise, again, his voice is very consistent. He's getting these really nice low notes that are far more prevalent now than they were at any point in the single exclamation point era. So it's really nice to see that even though by now his voice has been established, they're starting to do more things with it. And that might seem like a natural progression, and it probably is, but at least they're taking advantage of it. ときめき見逃さない好きの狙いやや首元で揺れる今冬中ののなどうか頭が飛んじゃったという間に終わっちゃう一度限りの急展開の点まで行ってみる押して押されての疾走圏まだ折れないな君の光線が So one of the other things I don't think I've mentioned too much in this video yet is, in a lot of the other ones I always talked about whether vocalists tended to sing on the beat or behind the beat. And that's one of the other slight differences between Hinata and Yuta, is that Hinata typically is the former and Yuta is usually the latter. When you have a song like this that has a very strong, percussive, rhythmic line going, he is still able to stay on top of it very well, which is no surprise given who's voicing him. But at the same time, the character voice in and of itself kind of has that more laid-back feel to it. So it is still possible to maintain that voice while keeping a very rhythmic feeling to the singing, and I think this song is a good example of that. So we've got the second event that Yuta was the featured 5-star in, and again, I think this song shows off a lot more of what he can do with his voice. It's kind of the first two-wink song where they get what I would call rapping sections. There's been a couple other songs where they'll have, like especially at the last one, there'll be the end of sentences where they kind of go into talking instead of singing, but it's not really straight up rapping. And it's interesting because, you know, back in like 2018, 2019, there were a bunch of people saying you would never ever hear a rap part in an idol game. Like those two things did not go together, it would never happen. And now I think pretty much every idol game has had some form of rapping in their songs. Sometimes I feel like they overdo it a little bit and they throw it into songs where it doesn't necessarily fit that well. But this is one where I think it does. And you might be saying, okay, well, Soma plays a character in Hypnosis Mic. Obviously, he has experience with rapping. It's not exactly the same thing. And the reason I say that is because just like when it comes to singing, there is not one way to rap. There are a lot of different styles of rap. And if you are not familiar with Hip Mike, Gentaro, the character that Soma voices, is a writer, and a lot of his rapping is very lyrical and kind of reflects that, whereas the rapping in this song in particular is much more rhythmic. The other thing I wanted to notice, and I will play an example of it here, is that now that they're finally allowing Yuta to actually physically sing lower pitches, he's able to inject a lot more vibrato because, like I said earlier, when you're trying to do this kind of breathy voice effect and vibrato at the same time, it doesn't necessarily work. But because he's using such a low pitch, his natural vibrato can come out a lot more and it sounds really nice. So that's another advantage to kind of allowing him to sing lower in general. Again, very nice vibrato at the end. This one is interesting because I feel like this is the first time since Yuta's voice has really been established that he is singing higher parts for longer. Like sometimes he'll pop up to a high note, but there are actually sections of this where the notes stay high pretty much the whole time. The other thing I wanted to mention in this is I also think this is the first time that Yuta goes into falsetto. Normally if there's any sort of, again, belting or falsetto or head voice things happening, Hinata would be doing them. Yuta normally doesn't. And obviously Soma can do falsetto fine. He's done it in other series where I've heard it. In this case, again, he is really, really trying to keep the Yuta voice intact. So what he does is, again, he almost hits under the note before sliding up to it, which is something that we would normally term a vocal cry. And it's funny because back when I was in musical theater, they always told us not to overdo the vocal cry because it was bad for your voice. It actually does help in situations like this and is probably the right thing to do. And Soma doesn't actually do it a whole lot with Yuta, but a lot of other characters, you'll hear that he does it more often. And a vocal cry is basically, it's like a little pitch change that shoots you onto the note that you're trying to get to. It is deliberate, it's not that hard to do, but at least for me, if I wanted to do it, it's something I'd have to think about. If you want to hear an example of a character in Ensemble Stars that does a lot of it, Izumi is probably the best one. But I'm glad that it happens here because it establishes that Yuta can indeed go into falsetto, keep his voice, and have it sound good. So that takes us to the end of the Twink songs, so let's move into the other group songs. So here we have another example of the cross-unit song where Yuta actually gets to sing with each and every member of Crazy Bee. And I haven't talked a whole lot about vocal mixing in this video yet because it's just one guy singing with himself for the majority of it. But Soma's voice is very easy to mix with because his natural tone is fairly neutral, so a lot of other voices will sound good with it, but also because, as we've already established, he's very good at shifting his tone around to fit whatever's happening at the time, so he could probably sound good with just about anyone. And in this case with Crazy Bee is one of those units that has, in its simplest form, two characters that have higher voices, two characters that have lower voices. He's singing with all of them, he sounds good with all of them. Vocaloids in my Ensemble Stars? No. It is kind of funny that he gets the one line with Len, and then the only other notable duet he has in this is with Hinata. He doesn't actually get to sing with anyone from Switch, and I understand in the sense that there's Vocaloids in Ensemble Stars. They had to make them the showcase and have them do a little more with this cover song in particular. So there's not a whole lot to talk about in terms of singing with new voices, but his solo parts in this are incredibly low. I would say this is probably going lower than anything he's done with Twink before, to the point that I feel like sometimes the music is actually a little bit loud when he's singing, so they probably could have adjusted the mix on that a tiny bit. This is another one of those songs I think I mentioned last time with Starlight Parade, how it was a song that suited both units. Again, both Switch and Twink have a lot of electronically inspired music, so I think they were kind of the perfect units to put with a Vocaloid song. And I think in this case, him singing super low is just a matter of the fact that the Vocaloids that are in this, in Miku, Len, and Rin, all have really high voices. There are obviously ones that have lower voices, but in this case, all of the human vocalists had to sing a little bit lower, except for Sora, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But just to keep the balance, and I think it does work really well. It's still really cool that they created 3D models for the Vocaloids just for this. But, the power of Hatsune Miku and all that, so I understand. There's not really a whole lot to talk about with Heartache Cafeteria. He gets like one word with Koga. We'll get to more Koga later, so we'll talk about it then. And then he gets a tiny, tiny bit with Shu. Again, we've established, even though we don't get to hear a whole lot of it, unfortunately, that Yuta will probably sound good singing with anyone. And his solo parts, nothing really new there. Again, we kind of get a baseline for his voice, which I think is quite a bit deeper than it was back in Trick with Treat. So, wanted to put it in there just to show how his speaking voice has also evolved over time along with his singing voice. So the only other character he gets to sing with here is Nikki, and we've already talked about that back in Lemon Squash Cheers, which was a longer solo. The thing about this song that I find interesting is that looking at the lineup and the style of music, Hinata would seem to fit it a lot more. But I think Yuta works in this situation because it is so high energy and all of the other voices involved are so high energy that it kind of needs something to temper it or it would just go completely off the rails. So I think Yuta's voice being more mellow, kind of pulling it back when it needs to, is actually really helpful and keeps it from just sounding frantic. So I feel like that's probably why they stuck him in there instead of Hinata, since obviously with these, and I still don't even know what to call these special songs that they're releasing, there's no rhyme or reason as to who's involved. I think some characters won't be at all. Naru's in 2 of them, so, there doesn't really seem to be a reason why certain characters would be picked over another in terms of distribution. So I think in this case it is just because his voice is such a contrast to the others that it ends up working with the song. The harmonies with Koga in this are so good. I've listened to those last 2 parts so many times. I love it. They sound great together. Otherwise, I realized that I didn't put this song in the Ray compilation because I forgot that they recorded a special version of it for the April Fool's event, and I was like, oh, Ray was in Endless Feed. That was his only April Fool's song. It wasn't. Never count Ray Sakuma out when it comes to being involved in songs. But since he had 29 songs, I don't feel particularly bad about leaving it out. I'll put it in all of the other ones that were involved, so you'll get to hear what his voice sounds like regardless. And in this one, we also get Yuta singing with both Mao and Ray. Same sort of thing applies as what we talked about before. He'll sound good with pretty much anyone. Soma's normal vocal inflections are distinctive enough that you can generally hear him in whatever sort of mix is going on, and that kind of applies to every character that he plays. I think I had actually mentioned it back when I was doing the character comparison and then cut it out because it didn't fit with the other things I was talking about. But that's one of the things about his voice I think is fairly distinctive, is just the way he sings. And he tends to maintain that regardless of what sort of character voice or tone that he's using. And you can hear it a lot when he's singing with other people. You still know that he's there. So the only thing we've got left to look at are the solos, so let's do that. 体中がドキドキしてる花色のペンで予想してみようきっとハート癖になるんだ刺激的に Feel so free Feel so free 次を期待しちゃうね心に触れて Spicy Breeze. I don't think there's a whole lot to say about Spicy Breeze in terms of a vocal analysis perspective. I like it as a song. It was on the first Twink album, so that's obviously getting closer to the end of the single exclamation point era where his voice is already fairly well established. It does go quite high. He maintains his tone as Yuta pretty well throughout all of it. It's a song I like listening to, but again, I don't necessarily have anything new to say about it in terms of this video. And I still feel like I was being unnecessarily harsh on Fiery Scream in the Ray video because there's nothing wrong with it as a song and I enjoyed listening to it. It's just for this style of video in particular, I'm kind of always looking for new things to say or new things to talk about, and sometimes the solos don't give that. So even if it seems like I'm being negative, it's not because I hate the songs and think they're the worst thing ever. I generally do enjoy listening to them a lot. There's just not a whole lot for me to talk about in terms of this particular video. So I hope that clarifies that a little bit. Let's look at the next one.
先の見えない景色はまるで夕日は一筋の道になるだってね冒険はあの未来へ続くルパ後悔はしたくないさ裏のトンネルの出口に通じてるかも向いたりしないさ It's my way of life
I do like A Way of Light a lot, actually. There's a lot of cool things happening, again, with the percussive elements to the background of it, with the kind of synthy melody that plays between the lines of the chorus, which you can't really hear in this example because I took out all of that to put in place of the singing. And kind of personal gripe, I feel like there's this misconception that if someone is a quote-unquote musician, they don't like electronic music. Which, at least in my case, isn't true. I like a lot of electronic music. What I always find a little bit questionable is when electronic music is used to mimic real instruments. Because there are ways that real instruments sound that can never quite be replicated electronically. But when we're talking about things like these kind of strange percussive noises, synth, things that are meant to be electronic, I find that mixing them into songs generally works really well for me, and I think this song is an example of that musically. In terms of the vocals, I would say this is kind of a good culmination of everything we've talked about so far. The verses are really, really low, so Yuta's, again, able to use that rich, low tone that he's very capable of. It gets pretty high when you get into the chorus and the pre-chorus parts, and he's maintaining his voice really well throughout all of that. So even though I feel like the song itself structurally is fairly simple, it is a good showcase of his voice, and in essence, I feel like that's what solos are supposed to be. In terms of the content, I feel like there's, again, some similarities between the solos. The biggest thing is A Way of Light, lyrically, I think is a lot more of an expression of Yuta finding himself, as opposed to thinking of himself as one of a pair. And that's a big part of Yuta's progression, and I think it's really interesting that, at least in this case, his character progression has kind of gone hand in hand with his vocal progression as the years have gone on. I don't necessarily think that was entirely pre-planned, as in I don't think at the very beginning that was meant to be the case, but I think it's ended up working really well and has established both of the twins as their own characters and kind of going on their own paths despite still being in the same unit and still having those similarities that will always be there. But they're very different from each other now, and the music reflects that, and I think it's a really good progression kind of in every way that it could have been. And that brings us to the end, so that was really fun. I think back in the first video I'd made a comment saying that I could talk about Soma's voice for a long time. I think I have proven that in this video. One of the things I was going to say and then realized I couldn't is that I can't actually tell you to go watch him in Ensemble Stars Lives because, you know, if there was a human being that could master mitosis, it would be him, but that hasn't happened yet. So the only thing I can tell you is that if you want to see him being in character on stage, find like an Idolish 7 or a Hypnosis Mic concert and watch that. It'll prove the points that I'm trying to make here. Regardless, I hope that was interesting. I think I've actually gained a new appreciation for Twink songs just from doing this project, which is one of the things I kind of hoped it would do. I don't know if I've ever said specifically, but I think my three favorite groups musically are probably Undead, Valkyrie, and Akatsuki in terms of any song that they do I'm probably going to like. So it's nice to be able to look at some of the other units in more depth in ways that I probably wouldn't have otherwise. As for what's next, I have had a lot of requests to do Natsume, and I find his voice fascinating, so I will be doing Natsume next. After that, I'm probably going to tackle the big units, because units that have 5 members, I would like to spread out a little bit more. So someone from Ryusei Tai, probably Kanata, since that was the first request I had for that unit, and then someone from Knights, and I haven't quite figured out who I want to do for Knights yet. So again, if you have a preference or want to leave a request in the comments, please feel free to do so. Again, please like, comment, do all the things that the algorithm wants you to do. Apparently that's a thing I say now. Otherwise, I do hope you enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts, and I will see you next time.